So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Liza Walworth, Vice President with Ipsos's Qualitative Research Team. Liza, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really thrilled to be able to share the work that we've been doing over almost a year with you. My name is Liza Walworth. I'm a consumer anthropologist, and I designed and led the study that we'll be discussing today in partnership with my colleague and friend, Jesse Itzkovitz. And to tell you a little bit about why we're doing this webinar, the study was meant to capture the impact of COVID on people's beliefs and behaviors as the pandemic sort of rolled out across the country. And 2020 being what it was, we got way more than we had initially anticipated over the course of the study. And we feel that the ways in which our respondents adapted, evolved, switched back, their various approaches to all of these different forces and the resulting swirl have implications for 2021. So we'll be talking a little bit about what this means for you and your business as we move into this next year of the pandemic, exacerbating and exposing certain other things about American society. In this case, it wasn't just COVID-19, it was also the social and racial inequalities, and then the long preceding polarization of a political nature. So to recap briefly the design, for those who haven't been following us along this entire journey, the initial thought was, let's look at 5 different states. And so I chose Washington, where COVID had first begun to test us, then New York at that time, this was early May when we launched, New York City was being crushed. And then to round things out from a demographic, political, and lots of different angles, we wanted to also include Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia. So we'd be able to capture different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different political leanings. We had a red, a blue, some trending purple states, and it gave us a great mix across these 25 households in terms of life stage, employment, whether you had children at home, whether you had children who'd gone off to college but then were suddenly back home. We had a lot of different things that we could track beginning in May until actually last week. And what this allowed us to do was look at the ongoing impact of everything happening at 3 different levels. So we had the national macro view of how COVID was impacting America as a whole, but then able to drill in a little bit in terms of regional, state level, and then go even further into county, into local governments, into school districts, and then most importantly, what this meant on an individual and household level, from lockdown to learning how to cook new things that you found on YouTube, becoming more invested in Black Lives Matter, going back to a restaurant when you could, the lines at the time of the election, and we'll talk a little bit too about what happened when the holidays came around. So it was a very gratifying and educational experience, and I think the thing that has stuck with me the most is how, with all of the big data that was coming at us in terms of COVID, we were able to live with people, be part of their lives, and understand what this meant on an individual, really personal level. A great example of how the personal story was actually a journey that went in many different directions is Kelly. Kelly is a 63-year-old retiree who lives with 2 roommates in Phoenix, and he shows how the 3 different forces at play in 2020 were very intersectional. He started off being not really concerned about COVID and wasn't taking many precautions. Numbers started to spike in Arizona. He suddenly got a lot more serious. And then he started to relax, and then he canceled his trip to Hawaii for Thanksgiving. So there were some shifts back and forth in terms of how he felt about the pandemic. And all this time at home, not being able to eat out at restaurants or not wanting to eat out at restaurants like he normally would, He watched a lot of news and he educated himself more about what was happening when George Floyd was murdered. He actually attended the protests for BLM in Phoenix and lost a number of friends on Facebook, either defriended them or they started to block him. And so COVID, the racial inequities, all of these things started to, compound in terms of how he was feeling politically. He was a lifelong Republican, had in every election voted fully Republican up and down the ticket, and he started to track left because of the COVID response, because of what was happening in terms of racial injustice. And this actually was the area where he moved around the most because he didn't really like the Democratic National Convention. And then there was stuff about, we could not keep track. We couldn't predict where he was going to land. And so you'll see in a video later on in this webinar how he feels about that eventual vote that he cast. The one thing that Kelly does not speak to was probably the biggest disruption in terms of daily life impact for folks who had kids. Kelly has no children, has no grandchildren, and so back to school was not something that he grappled with in the fall, nor did he have any personal experience of the chaos that came in the spring during the initial lockdowns. So this video features the rest of our sample and has some key stories from August and September. It will allow some of us to relive those moments and speak to some of the frustrations and different situations that people were encountering because of what COVID was doing to going to school and the ability to work. So if you are listening to this through the phone, please turn on your speakers for your computer because the audio is going to play through that. And this video is about 5 minutes long. So just prepare yourself for a number of different stories about what it was like to go back to school. Just bear with me as I switch screens here. All right.
I think online school is pretty cool and stuff. I don't really think we're learning anything though.
He's not engaged. It's hard to keep him engaged. We can't hear the teacher. The teacher can't hear him. We log on, working good for a little bit. Then it kicks us out. We aren't able to get back in because the system is just overwhelmed. I really do hope and pray that they open the school soon so we can get back to some good education and learning.
Waiting for the host to start meeting. I'm trying not to get annoyed. I guess Zoom, because that's what we're working with today, is so jammed with, I guess, so many other kids and teachers in New York City, because today is like the first day. So she's going to reschedule it for later. So before with the remote learning, they would just see their teacher once a week for a half an hour. No one was helping them. They are no longer going to do that. She's going to have a schedule that she will follow with her class. She can actually speak to her teacher. So I'm excited about that because I feel like now my child is going to actually learn something and she's not going to, turn into a dumb kid.
Okay, so this is how we're set up for homeschool stuff. Josh sits in here for his college class stuff. This is our music room / laundry room. Over here we have where Noah is set up. Do you feel like you learn as much when it's online teaching?
Not really.
Even though your mom's doing a ton to help you?
Mm-hmm.
Does it feel like a lot, Roz?
Yeah.
Yeah. Rosalind's really tired of having to help. I just told her we should just have him not do some of his special needs stuff. But she really feels like we got to keep pushing and doing it.
We think it's a great option for kids to go back to school. Our son's in special education, so most of his classes are 8 or less to begin with. So we don't really feel as concerned because that's a small number of students for him to be around. Next Monday, they're starting 2 days a week for A through M on Mondays and Tuesdays. Virtual learning will be the other 3 days out of the week. I wish they would have started with this rather than waiting a month into the school year and going back.
So I'm a freshman in high school, and my school started out with hybrid, but they have since switched over to everyone being back. However, I've been doing school from home along with a few people out of my grade. It's been a little difficult because teachers have to come up with a separate thing for me and those other people to do.
We're still holding off for the next time she can then, come back to school. The only problem with that is they're insistent on playing football. You have this bubble somewhat set up. Now you're going to add in other schools, not social distancing. So I'm number one on the list of endangered COVID. So now we have to wait and see how that turns out.
Our university just came out with this kind of what to expect when coming back to campus. And overall, I've been pretty disappointed when we're kind of reading this and hearing about the response. It seems like it's very independent based. It's very, you should be doing this before you come, but it's not mandated or required.
I'm totally for them going back to school, especially it's my daughter's senior year. I want her to experience school for the last year. Am I being selfish? No. Children have a stronger immune system. So Amari starts her senior year tomorrow, remotely in her bedroom. I actually feel pretty good about her starting remotely since we all had COVID. It's just a little bit more real to us, at least to me. So my thoughts have changed dramatically.
My children all go to school online as well. Still, they're all in high school. Their school has not said anything about them going back in person anytime soon. Their school's actually been really terrible about communicating.
I'd rather be in person. It's easier.
Why do you think it's easier?
Hands-on learning, and that's the way I learn.
Well, the teacher's going to be teaching through like a camera.
I don't have people around me.
So basically what teaching from home entails is me using a slideshow. I love Google Slides. That's my favorite. Here's my little workspace. This is my talking partner, the stuffed animal. Our alphabet letters, our math book that we use. I have my tablet back there, and then a list of student information, like their login information and stuff, because they keep getting logged out. Some amazing teachers on Facebook have created all these amazing libraries, and it's so great. And then the kids have story time. They love story time. I have one student that's always like, is it story time yet? Is it story time yet? They did just do a survey, my school district, and asked what we would prefer to do. And I posted that I have no preference. If they need me at school, I'll go to school. If they prefer that I stay online, I'll stay online.
Awesome. Great video, Liza. And I think for those of us that are parents, this accurately reflects the uncertainty so many of us have had around schooling. Not only will schools open or not, but will school be open this week as we've seen COVID affect different classrooms around the nation. And I think, if you go to the next slide, Liza, I think it really kind of starts to get into what does this mean? What is the impact of just not only this uncertainty, but the duration of this uncertainty. And, so when we think about Brandeis and, she works in a hospital, it's exhausting, right? And we see her kind of constantly dealing with the uncertainty of her job, of her situation, of the disease, and of her son's schooling. If we look at Jaron, Jaron's not only had a difficult year understanding what's going to happen to his career financially, given kind of the close client interaction that he typically needs to do in order to run his business, but also just uncertain about, are his children getting the help that they need? Am I overburdening my family by having my wife teach my children? He lives across the river from downtown Portland, and there's even the uncertainty of his son going over to a protest after the latest news has occurred without him really even knowing kind of where that is. And so, those faces I think that they both have are ones that we can all relate to. And I think from a behavioral science perspective, we typically know that when we're tired, when we're downtrodden, when we're overwhelmed, and when we're uncertain, this is really a point where our non-conscious biases tend to flourish. And this can be kind of, both good and bad, but it really reflects kind of what these hidden motivations are and how they affect what they do. So if you go to the next slide, Liza, I think something fascinating that we saw throughout this was really relates to this behavioral science principle known as regulatory focus. And, regulatory focus is very much, a part of our personality. So it is who we are, but it's also dependent on the context or what we're thinking. And in general, we can almost think about this as optimists and pessimists, although it's a little bit more complex than that, and I think promotion-oriented people, they're really looking to seek out opportunities. So it's almost like, what can I still do during COVID? How do I make the best out of this situation? So, my sourdough starter is still bubbling away. What successes can I mark to show what I've done? What are the things that I've accomplished during this year? And we often see this tendency to kind of remain in motion. I want to take action. I want to do things. I don't necessarily want to spend my time evaluating and assessing all of the potential things that I can do. Now, on the flip side of this are people who tend to be a little bit more prevention-oriented, and they tend to be loss-averse. And whereas promotion-oriented people are thinking about how do I make things better, prevention-oriented people are thinking about how do I bring things back to normal? How do I just make sure that everything is okay? And so we heard a lot about, how do I protect myself and my family? What do I do to kind of relieve this anxiety that I have? What can I do to just feel calm again? Are there new duties and obligations that I have to take care of? Starting with wiping down the groceries to now thinking about, what is going to be a COVID safe activity for my kids to do at school or after school. And then unlike, the action-oriented people who are promotion-focused, prevention-focused is really about assessment. How do I make sure I'm doing the right things? What are the boxes I can check to let me know that I haven't failed myself in trying to do the right thing? And what's fascinating is, we really saw this show up in a number of different ways within our participants in the study. So if you go to the next slide, I think we have really three nice examples of this. So we heard from Allison before, and in June, she's ready to send her kids back to school. And across the pandemic, since it started, she wants to do things in the same way that she did before. She wants to live this pre-COVID life. And so she's constantly seeking out, like, what can I do? What are the opportunities that are there? You know what? The restaurants are empty. We can go there and be there. And so, talking about her hosting parties, talking about her hosting birthday parties, these are things that she continued to do there. Now, if we look at Brandeis, Brandeis is also exhausted. She wants things to return to normal, but we saw a little bit more of a prevention orientation there. And it was interesting because even though she's a nurse, the prevention wasn't necessarily around personal safety. As we saw case numbers start to kind of dwindle during August, she's like, look, I don't want to wear the mask, but I'm going to wear the mask to prevent kind of the social exclusion or ostracization that I might feel otherwise. I don't want to be the oddball, and making sure that others aren't thinking of me negatively was really the way that kind of encouraged her to wear the mask. And then finally, if we look at Jaron, I think his wife really demonstrated how this works out even within an individual themselves. We saw her, I want to celebrate Halloween, I want to have a special event for my family, but I also know that there's kind of some restrictions that I have to do there. So we can't, dress up and put the candy out ourselves. Let's create these bags that we can do. So it's this constant balancing of desire and risk that we saw, really reflective of not only kind of their individual disposition, which we saw definitely carry through, but also the individual events that they were considering. And I think this really has some kind of key marketing implications. I think, first of all, for you, when we think about a product, some products are typically promotion, like a lottery ticket. Awesome things might happen if I scratch it off and win. Or, a vaccine or an alarm system being like, bad stuff won't happen if I get this. But what about those products in the middle? What about things that might have switched one way or the other? Right. So thinking about, CBD related products, whereas that might have been seen as an enhancement or as a promotion oriented kind of product in the past. Now the calming effects that brings might actually be seen more as a prevention item. Later on, Liza will talk about some of the shifting values and behaviors that we saw. We even saw chores that people used to do. Oh, I don't want to do that. How do I minimize the time, going to the grocery store, are now thought of in a promotion way. This is my time alone. I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to come home with 5 or 6 pints of ice cream because it's my way to treat myself. And I think that really clues us into like not only have, some of these products changed in regulatory focus, but some of the jobs to be done of some of the products and services that people are consuming have also changed. And it's interesting to see how kind of the changing attitudes and usage by consumers, how that might have affected, what the real competition is for that time and budget that consumers have. I think secondly, Liza, you brought up the story of Kelly, and it's fascinating, right? We've seen him vacillate back and forth. And from a promotion and prevention standpoint, he's also been very different. He was very much promotion oriented and kind of learning to do new things during COVID. But then when it came to his own activism around BLM, very prevention oriented, didn't want to step on anyone's toes. I'm an old white guy. What do I know? Am I going to say the wrong thing? And so thinking about the segmentations that you've developed, the personas that you have those shifted? Have there been fundamental changes in their outlook and the way that they view the world around them in terms of their activities, their interests, their opinions, and their behaviors? And I think psychologically, we're also interested in safety. And I think, Bill and his daughter are really great examples of that. It's a key concern that we want to feel safe now. It's table stakes, I think, for most companies to show that they can provide that safe experience. Are we contributing to that? And then finally, when we get to exhaustion, when we think about all the consumer touch points that we have, are they really being designed to help the consumer? Are they being designed to be easily understood and fluent? And I think, while consumers are certainly more susceptible to bias, it means they're more susceptible to nudges that can help them as well. And thinking about like, what are the ways that I can help people make decisions that are going to be more beneficial to their short-term outcomes, to their long-term outcomes in society. This is really a case where we can bring some of that non-conscious influence into play. And I think, all of this really leads into this next section about recalibration. So like, not only have things been uncertain, but we've adapted. And Liza, I'd love for you to tell some of the stories of what we've seen here.
For sure. So in talking about how people have had this ongoing recalibration of attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, we've seen a number of different disruptions. Let's see if this will move forward here. Across 2020. And, we begin with lockdown, where Angela couldn't go to Starbucks to get her favorite drink, so she started to make it at home. And it tasted pretty good, and it was way cheaper. But then when Starbucks was open again, she was enticed back through some sort of promotion. You're going to lose your rewards unless you come get your favorite drink, and by golly, it tasted better than what she was making at home. So that was just the beginning of a number of disruptions that caused people to think and rethink and amend some of their behaviors in response to all those different forces and swirl that were depicted in the earlier slide. We've talked about the civil unrest. We've mentioned spikes in cases. Oh, I can go back to restaurants. Oh, no, I'm going to eat at home, as we saw with Kelly. And then, of course, the video on back to school. And for the fourth quarter, I want to highlight two, and forgive me if this first one is a little bit of a stretch, but it, to my mind, is important in terms of, first, how people participated in the election. A lot of our respondents mailed in their ballots or voted early, or voting on the day in person took on new significance to them, as you can see from Shamika's picture of the line in New York City. And then in terms of a disruption, there was the new way in which the results were called. You didn't find out later that night on CNN. And for a number of our participants, the fact that it took a long time, especially in some really critical states, they began to question the legitimacy of the election. And the second area where we saw a lot of shifts in terms of behavior, some new focus in terms of value, was holidays. And you've seen some pictures of trick-or-treating across these slides, but with Thanksgiving, most of our folks thought, you know what, things aren't going very well. We're not going to travel the way that we normally would. We're going to play it low key. We had others who continued to do what they would do every single year. And that had an impact on Christmas. There were some, like Eric in Georgia, who, as a family, they were not able to go to Mickey's very special Christmas at Disney like they do every single year. They stayed home. And for others, they were forced to stay home. Allison, despite having COVID, despite, and we'll continue to talk about her fluctuations, she was just totally hell-bent on getting to California to spend Christmas with her mom, and wasn't able to eventually because of the lockdown. She could not go to California. So on the whole, people found new meaning, created, new moments despite these disruptions. You can see Chanel's Christmas card. Folks tried to have a sense of humor about this and, tried to look at things in terms of the upside, the time together, and the creation of COVID memories. And it's COVID itself that also caused a bit of recalibration, sometimes expected, sometimes a little unexpected. We had a number of participants who had personal experience with COVID, starting with Shamika, who entered the study in May, having had COVID. Her mother had COVID, and her father had passed away from COVID. Jaron, who you saw, was very much in that risk-averse bucket. He had a friend die of COVID, and that just reaffirmed his commitment to playing things safe. Then Chanel is very interesting because she, as a teacher, wasn't so sure how she felt about the vaccine. Her family got COVID. Their symptoms weren't that bad. They had Thanksgiving as normal. Even just a couple weeks ago, she was talking about, I don't think I'm going to do it. And then within just the past few days, she did a total 180. This is a picture that she shared with us. We have actually lots of video of her receiving the vaccine, her first dose, because she has decided that while the school district has not come out and said it, they will likely require all teachers to be vaccinated for next school year. And then there were the social norms, all of her fellow teachers and what they were saying about what they thought people should do, what teachers' responsibility were in terms of the vaccine. Allison, we know, had some response to the fact that she ended up in the ER twice. She's diabetic. Her mother and father-in-law both were quite sick when this group of 13 people got COVID. Her pastor, the lead pastor for the congregation that her husband is part of and is a pastor at, the pastor's wife died. So despite all of this, very personal and pronounced impact, she then, went back to having Christmas parties with everybody coming over and not wearing a mask. Eric, who really didn't like wearing a mask when they went to Disney in the fall, he would talk about how COVID was a hoax. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, his grandmother died of COVID. And so now he's being very careful, hand sanitizer, mask, the works. And then finally, Regina, the oldest person in our sample, one of my respondents, and a stage 4 cancer patient. She has breast cancer that is metastasized into her lungs. She has been unable to talk with me recently or share videos because this week is week 6 of her COVID symptoms. And this is a woman who had been scrupulously careful in terms of her behavior. This was a picture of her going on her weekly shopping trip, where she would go to the drive-thru at Starbucks as her treat, because otherwise she was home in her mobile home, just watching a lot of news and hanging out with her dog. And her family, I haven't been able to verify this with her, but I know that her family wasn't taking things as seriously as she was. And so I wonder if that is how she ended up getting COVID. So the calibration and recalibration continued across the year. And the way that the little things, as Angela says in this quote, have taken on new meaning is going to have implications for 2021. Family connection, whether it was in person, Regina with her family unmasked here, or over Zoom, as you can see, Angela's picture here, that's Brandis's son. They were making cookies earlier on. That's Chanel's family praying before a meal. There are a lot of things in terms of exercise, mindfulness, being outside, being together And, COVID helping sort of push away the noise and let people focus on what's important, that is a key recalibration in terms of what has value to them. And in the case of Allison, while we had the prolonged duration and the exhaustion that we saw with Brandis and Jaron, she would sort of vacillate between desire and risk, promotion, prevention, but she would always sort of come back to that center. For her, that center is her religion and her conservative beliefs. And, here's her husband on Sundays when it was lockdown and they couldn't go to the church. She's wearing a mask because she has to at Hobby Lobby. You can see how thrilled she was to be out of lockdown and able to go to the store and get some stuff for crafts. They were okay with remote school for Amari because of COVID, but are now starting to get a little less tolerant of it. It's had a number of things for her that have caused her sort of priorities, her behaviors, her attitudes to shift, but she keeps coming back to that wanting to do what she wants to do and not have anyone tell her what she has to do. And the way that she gets information and the sources of information that she chooses are filtered through religion and her conservative political beliefs. And so I just want to use that as the segue into the two other components that we've seen recently in terms of trust deteriorating across our sample. And the examples I want to give quickly, I know we're running in on time here, but the vaccine. Ipsos had a poll that we just released yesterday that talked about how thankfully we're seeing an increasing number of Americans open to taking the first generation COVID vaccine, but there are still 39% who are not very likely or opposed to getting that first gen vaccine if it becomes or when it becomes available to them. And we have some of those 39%ers in our sample. And it's not just Allison, whose religious beliefs and her anti-abortion stance mean that she doesn't want herself or any of her family to get it because she feels there's a linkage between aborted fetuses and the vaccine. We also have those who are immunocompromised and or African American and just don't feel like the vaccine has been adequately tested on them. And then there are those who just want to wait. They just want to see more people get it and gauge how many allergic reactions are happening before they themselves will be ready to get the vaccine. The other area in terms of trust, somewhat tied to the vaccine, to how COVID has been handled at a local, state, federal level, tied to the presidential election that some of our folks think is fraudulent, it's the government. We had people who either felt that the government was a system that was supposed to support people in a time of need. And you had other people who felt that government wasn't supposed to tell them what to do. It's supposed to stay out of their life. So a lot of folks have been recalibrating how they feel about not just a party, but government itself, writ large. And we've got a quote from Elizabeth talking about how she feels that fraud happened and people got away with it. And of course, this all came to a head on January 6th. So I'm going to show you one more video where our respondents all reflect upon what happened in DC. Again, turn on your speakers to get the audio for this. And let me just quickly switch over. This is about 4.5 minutes long, and then Jesse will come in with some good news and take us home. So here we go.
Okay, so this is how I would characterize the events of January 6th with the attack on Capitol Hill.
So, yesterday, wow. Definitely one for the history books.
Like, as a teacher who has to teach children self-control and, acceptable behavior, that's not acceptable behavior.
A complete embarrassment to the United States of America. And I am so ashamed that I voted for Trump at the last minute.
I honestly knew something like silly like that was gonna happen, and not even silly. I thought it was really disgusting. That's not American at all. You know, who behaves that way?
I feel that it was I feel like it was staged, and if they did actually get in there, I think they should be prosecuted.
Whoever was in charge, there was lack of leadership. It needs to be investigated. Do I think it was President Trump's fault that these domestic terrorists went in and stormed our nation's capital? No.
Yesterday, unfortunately, was not what I envisioned as the path of my party. We would have had another 4 years of the president, but because of what has transpired or his inability to be presidential has turned off some people, white people in the suburbs. He did not lose because of African Americans or Hispanics, or he lost because white people abandoned him. And they abandoned him because he lied. That's tough for me to say. He lied. And he lied to us.
You know, they were ready to kill the protesters last summer, and if those people that were present yesterday looked like me or my brother or my dad or my uncle, cousin, whatever, they would be talking about body counts, and that is the honest truth.
I feel like that is white privilege at its finest. These people were allowed to go in and ransack and put the lives of our elected officials in jeopardy. I completely disagree with what they did.
Seeing all the Congress members on the balconies kind of cowering. And I remember distinctly there was a lady in the back who was praying really loudly, really intensely. And even though I'm not a religious person, that really struck a note about how scared and how humane and how human these people are, and then how scary a situation like that would have been.
But how can you blame President Trump for that? He wanted a peaceful protest. We have the right under our Constitution to have a peaceful protest. There's this man that's charged in the Capitol riot that people don't want to talk about. I'm watching Newsmax. They're a conservative outlet. His name's John Sullivan. Prior involvement in Utah riots for Black Lives Matter, Antifa, abolish the system. He was in our state's capital causing ruckus, and many other people were.
It's just drives me nuts. I'm looking forward to, I lean conservative. I'm looking forward to Trump being gone. I hope the media will just quit following him. It's just been destructive.
Being a lifelong Republican, the more I think about this, I think the Republicans got what they deserved. So I think I'm happy. I'm somewhat excited to see what happens after January 20th. It's been a while, and I'm ready to give the Dems a shot.
That's really amazing. I think, so much to unpack there from a behavioral science perspective in that one video alone. And, I think it does reflect a lot of just the recalibration that not only we faced as individuals, but also now as kind of a nation in terms of where we're going. Now, what does this mean for you? And I think, in many ways, although this recalibration is scary, it does present an opportunity. I think like we saw before, and like all of us have been aware of over the past couple months, we have developed new habits. Not only have we developed kind of new rituals and new behaviors and new ways of entertaining ourselves, of feeding ourselves, of kind of connecting with other people, but we've also attached new meaning to this, and really kind of thinking about, what are the things that drive us to be happy and be satisfied. And I think with all of these new habits mean that there's new opportunities to kind of insert yourself into those habits as a brand. Liza, I think, did a great job of outlining what these different steps of disruption have been. We know that even more new habits will occur after the vaccine as people start to enter, as we go back to the office, as we kind of sell those cars we bought because we're afraid to to go on the subway, there will be a lot of new behaviors too. And I think that having a keen eye on what those changes are and what they mean for your brand will really give a lot of opportunity. I think the point that Liza really ended with, which is around trust, is a real place where brands can come into. Our Ipsos Public Affairs Department has done incredible polling showing that, trust in the government continues to decrease. But the one interesting thing is that trust remains for corporations and brands. And so how will you use that? And so I do a lot of work with this company that you can see on the right. And, they've done a wonderful job of kind of thinking about how do we take this uncertainty, how do we take this lack of trust and actually do something about it? And that's not only kind of with their response to the pandemic, but if we think about their responses to the burning of stores and Black Lives Matter, and even how they're approaching kind of being a more inclusive and diverse company now, they're really trying to do things that are going to present their brand as a trusted source of information for the right things to do, especially when that seems to be in contention for a lot of America. Now, this really leads us to say, well, now what? What should we focus on going forward? So if you go to the next slide, Liz, I think there's really kind of three big takeaways that we'd like to leave you with. I think the first is, we really need to understand and support new consumer needs. And this begins with understanding our consumers. I think the one thing that we can all feel watching these videos is empathy, right? You actually feel what they're feeling. To what extent are you being empathetic to what their drives are, their motivations, the reasons why they're seeking out your brand, your product, the solutions that you offer? And so really understanding how they've changed are going to give you a clear road path on how to react. I think, as I mentioned before, trust and uncertainty are high. So how can we provide that? How do we show people that we're going to be safe if they choose us? How do we show them that their dollar is going to go further and we're going to provide them with a valuable solution, right? It doesn't have to be the cheapest, but they're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. And then finally, how do we show them that we align with the values that they have? And this really brings us to the third point, which is, this idea of political orientation and polarization is not going away. And I think that there are ways that brands can actually lean into this. So we know that conservatives and liberals react differently to different types of products. Some want status products, some want products that let us kind of be ourselves as individuals and show that we're unique, right? It doesn't mean that they don't want, Converse. It's just how do they want it spoken about? How do they want it thought about? And then the other aspect of this is not only as marketers, but as insights professionals, how do we avoid offense? And Ipsos has really been looking at, what are the bases of what cause us to feel offended, and really looking at, what are the steps that marketers should avoid? What are the landmines that are out there? And even how can we ask questions in a much more inclusive manner that make people feel welcome and not excluded? So these are really kind of continuing questions that we have. I know that we're at the end of our time today, so any of the questions that you asked, we'll certainly take the time to email you with. But really appreciate, the time that you've given us. And, I think the great work the ethnography team has done here really gives us a lens into what we've all been feeling and kind of really seeing through the eyes of these consumers as they've experienced in America in Flux.
Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Wow, that was a really, really interesting presentation, Liza and Jesse. I really enjoyed your review of the insights as well. So thank you both. And thank you everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. And of course, in the meantime, please reach out to us if you have any questions. That now concludes today's Ipsos webinar. Have a wonderful day. Bye.